A combination of all these things could realistically keep your lipid parameters in a spot as a bodybuilder that makes it pretty unlikely that you're going to end up with significant plaque buildup, which I think would be prudent even as early as your 20s for bodybuilders. And this is something to run by your doctor, of course. Now, as far as actual cardiac remodeling, having a high resting heart rate, high blood pressure chronically, these are things that would be addressed through What's up guys, Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're talking, unfortunately, about another prominent death in the bodybuilding community. This is Cedric McMillan, who has passed away in his 40s. He is a very, a fan favorite bodybuilder. He's won the Arnold Classic before, and I think he was probably one of Arnold's favorite competitors of all time from like the modern era, because he represented, the cross between aesthetics and size, and many people thought he had Olympia caliber, like Olympia winning potential if he just dialed in his conditioning. But in the recent years, he's had some struggles. Now, from what I understand, as far as history, besides being a massive bodybuilder, pushing the hormones, blah, 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 he had a bad case of pneumonia a handful of years ago, if I recall correctly, which had some level of damage on his cardiovascular system. And then more recently, a couple of years ago, he got the you-know-what that's going around, and he believes it had some lasting impact on his cardiovascular system as well. And he goes into it in this recent interview, NPC Armed Forces Nationals 2021. He kind of elaborates on his health status mid last year and how he also pushed past it against his doctor's advice and like bulked up past literally 300 pounds.
I can tell you guys, back in July, I was almost dead. Like literally notify your next of kin. My wife was with me, but I was out of here, seriously. But I didn't see no white light, so I don't know if I was that close, but looking at me from the outside, I was that close. I was in the hospital for about 3 weeks. I lost about 30 pounds. I was getting ready to go to the Arnold. And so I spent all of August trying to gain weight back, ignoring the doctor's advice. And then I spent about 4 weeks trying to get ready.
See, it's kind of unfortunate how this is like, they're laughing, and even the host is like laughing with them as if it's like, it's humor is implied in the ignored my doctor, like, but it's like, how many times have we seen these massive bodybuilders? There's typically some sort of like warning shot, with Dallas, he collapsed on stage. With a lot of bodybuilders, they had some level of like, something happened that they then survived through, which they then did not downsize significantly and implement like aggressive ancillaries and cardiovascular things to remodel the cardiovascular system or anything of that nature. Not all of them, by the way. Some of them I'm sure were successful in stopping, but there were a lot of guys who pushed through and ended up paying the price, unfortunately. And it seems like in general there is typically, now in some cases there's it's just out of the fucking blue, but in a lot of cases it seems in this industry we see something manifest itself, and then that's like the warning shot that you really need to aggressively pull back and like reverse what you're doing to whatever extent you can to maximize your longevity at that point, because it's just a ticking time bomb. But again, like a lot of things are proxies for that too, which we're going to get to soon, about how you can evaluate that risk well ahead of getting to that warning shot, because once you get to that warning shot, like you're pretty fucking compromised to a point where you probably induced pretty significant permanent damage.
I'm still sick. So that lets you know how damn crazy we are, But there's something that pulls us here that we just can't deny. So just try to be understanding. So I didn't leave. I had a damn time out. But coming here, I was gonna compete a few weeks ago, and I had to pull out of the show because I wasn't feeling well. So this is my first routine. And oh my God.
So I got to ask you, so you're one of my favorites. You have been for a long time.
So, he mentions how he had to pull out, and then he mentions he had like this chronic bout of hiccups and he couldn't keep any food down. He's slamming mass shakes, weight gainers just to like get calories in, and he's having to pull out of shows. He feels like shit. He's having a residual heart impact on the previous things that have happened to him in the last handful of years, on top of the gear, on top of the body weight, on top of everything. And it's just like a ticking time bomb waiting to happen, essentially. And he mentions, notably, how, we do crazy things and, basically implying that in the face of danger, they will still, proceed. And that is something, unfortunately, that not everyone can come to grips with really overcoming. And you see the difference in the guys who tried to keep their size versus the guys who successfully downsized and lived a much longer and normal looking lifespan. Like you have guys like Dorian Yates, great example of a guy who totally shifted his mindset and was able to overcome the probably extremely mentally difficult to come to terms with reality that he needed to downsize significantly to live a long time. Like he looks like he doesn't even bodybuild at this point, or at least last I saw him, he looks like a fucking athletic like yoga guy. Arnold Schwarzenegger, significantly downsized. He still had cardiovascular impacts too. And again, like even guys not on gear, the prevalence of cardiovascular disease, massive. Cancer, massive. Like this is at a base level, not doing fucking anything. As a natural, this is like a likely outcome for a lot of people. So as a bodybuilder who is potentially exposed to exacerbating factors too, like the going around, other things that may be involved with, clotting factors being increased, that can be problematic on top of the hematology inflating drugs you're using too, the body weight, the blood pressure modulation, it's all culminating in like a multifactorial disaster essentially. And you need to be able to like really take a step back and evaluate if what you're doing is sustainable, because ultimately a lot of people who just like ignore like transiently high blood pressure readings because they get like one, they're like, oh fuck, like I'm not going to check that again because it just like freaks me out. Or they get nosebleeds in the gym, or you get, you have sleep apnea. You're like falling asleep all the time every time you sit down, you fall asleep within 10 minutes and you don't know why. And you never feel rested because you've been like literally going to war in your sleep every night, and your heart's fucking literally getting damaged, and you're getting brain damage minorly like every night essentially, because you are literally apneaing like hundreds of fucking times a night. You don't even realize that. Like these are all things that they'll manifest themselves years from now, but they're definitely slowly, like these are little warning shots accumulating over years, and they shouldn't be ignored. Having a resting heart rate over 90 is not fucking normal. You're gonna die way sooner. Having a blood pressure of even like 130 over 90, like not good, bro. Like that is, like you could have worse obviously, but it's not acceptable necessarily either. So again, getting into, could this have been prevented? Again, I don't know how significant of an impact the pneumonia had, the getting the virus he had, all that shit. Apparently he had significantly decreased heart function as a result, but in it, like obviously the secondary impact or the primary impact of the body weight and hormone use was not helpful in dealing with that. So, even if we acknowledge that, okay, maybe there is a risk of cardiovascular impact of anything related to the from all angles of it is something to acknowledge. And yeah, you should be checking your clotting factors in your blood, get your fibrinogen checked, get your D-dimer checked, get these things evaluated, especially if you're a fucking bodybuilder. Like this is stuff that is, maybe new to think about adding to your blood panels as an assessment metric. But again, like these are all prudent things to be doing. As far as before you even get into the sport, your first cycle should not just be 500 tests and get your PCT and fucking cycle off. Like before that, you should have a baseline echocardiogram, in my opinion. I think you should have a baseline blood panel too that shows, especially for like gonadal function, like having your baseline gonadotropins, testosterone production is obvious shit, but having baseline hematology, baseline kidney metrics, glomerular filtration rate estimates based on cystatin C, these are all things that C-reactive protein, how much inflammation is in your body as a natural versus when you're on gear. Like this is all shit that would be highly, highly recommended and prudent beforehand, and is like maybe somewhat cost prohibitive, but ultimately the amount of money you're going to spend on food, gear, fucking all this shit is like your longevity and being able to do this and even know you can tolerate it is something that is, and your life itself is so outweighed by the minimal cost relative to that shit of the actual baseline imaging as well as blood work. So again, like even naturals, they sometimes find shit in their blood work that is aberrant. You know, how many people have fucked up lipids and die of atherosclerosis? Like so much shit that could have been picked up on if they were just proactive about it. This isn't just a warning for, this is more of a warning for enhanced guys, obviously, because of the video. The excessive body weight, high blood pressure, fucking gear, all that shit is so exacerbating of this stuff. But above and beyond that, even among naturals, I did a call with Greg O'Gallagher the other day, like one of the peak healthiest looking fucking insulin sensitive naturals in the fucking game, and his homocysteine was in the 70s, and he wouldn't have known that if he didn't get his blood work done. And then there's steps he's taking to correct that now that he knows what his genetic predispositions are. He actually has a polymorphism he didn't even know he had genetically. That kind of shit is only parsed out through actual accurate blood testing. And if you're a fucking bodybuilder, like, you should be having baseline organ imaging so you can actually assess morphological changes in function as you go. Because again, the development of what happens to a lot of these guys is they end up, you know, sustaining massive physiques year round. They have chronically high blood pressure is like one of the worst things. In addition, atherosclerosis. You saw Antoine Vaillant recently had a CAC score done, and his score was like 99th percentile of like shittiness, essentially. I'm not saying this to like, you know, knock on him, but I mean, like, that kind of thing should be like heavily, like, that is a warning shot in itself, you know? He's a young guy, and he could take that as a warning sign that maybe this is not what I should be doing. And again, there are things that you can monitor longitudinally that I think would otherwise confer a far greater likelihood of not dying early. Like, again, blood pressure modulation from the start. Angiotensin receptor blockade with something like a telmisartan might be prudent, working with your doctor, of course. Above, again, I'm like fucking rambling because there's so many different areas that I get so passionate about this topic. But when you start, if you're going to be doing this long term, again, some guys, you know, very few do like one cycle, 500 tests or whatever it is, and then they're done. That's few and far between though. Most guys end up using this shit long term in some capacity and end up blasting and cruising a lot of the time too. And especially for competitive bodybuilders, it's imposed on them essentially to require to sustain high body weight so they can advance and get better every year. That's understood. So going into this, when you have that baseline imaging, when you have that baseline blood work, also having a baseline fucking high tier doctor in your camp, like, besides finding the best source for gear and all that shit, find a high quality doctor too who is not going to be judgmental. I know that's easier said than done. It's fucking difficult. A lot of doctors will just literally like tell you to fuck off if you're on gear, but they exist. High quality doctors exist who will not judge you and will actually prescribe the blood work, get you the requisition forms for the blood work you need to stay on top of your shit from day one if you are transparent about it and you do your homework trying to find somebody who is actually intelligent, knowledgeable, non-judgmental, and, you know, is willing to oversee you. Because, you know, some just don't want it too. They don't want to acknowledge that, they don't want to oversee somebody who's doing things that are traditionally seen as taboo or risky or anything of that nature. But, you know, that's their own prerogative too. You know, they'll oversee people who have totally fucked up diets and are morbidly obese, but then they will tell a, you know, bodybuilder that he's negligent and he's a piece of shit, even if his diet's like perfectly dialed in, but he's on gear. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, some doctors do exist and providers who are very, very good and non-judgmental. And I cannot stress highly enough how important it is you find that person at the beginning, before you're halfway through the shit and have a warning shot, and then you try and find a fucking kidney specialist or a cardiologist or whatever. So again, from the start, blood pressure cuff, you gotta fucking have it on hand. You got to get a baseline panel done, at least baseline echocardiogram for morphology and function. And then from there, you can assess on a longitudinal basis. You don't even need a CAC score if you start from fucking day one, because you can assess your lipids as you go, fortunately. And there are experts that are quite adamant about certain lipid parameters that if you stay within a certain area, the likelihood or occurrence of atherosclerosis is essentially fucking impossible. Like, one of my favorite content creators is Peter Attia. He is a medical doctor, and he has a lot of information on lipid management and cardiovascular health and whatnot. He mentioned recently in a kind of like overview of his past, I don't know, few years of content or something like that, what he would do if he was, to intervene in a lipid context. And basically he says the most important things are, managing hypertension, obviously I mentioned at the start, but in addition, for managing ApoB. So this is basically lipoproteins that have ApoB on them. You'll see on a more extensive lipid panel things like LDL, IDL, VLDL, LP(a), and you'll hear about the different importance of all of these things. But ultimately, measuring ApoB is a very good proxy for atherosclerotic potential in the body. So regardless of what you're, like, I don't know how much C-reactive protein, inflammation, systemic, consequences of different things are going to impact actual plaque development at the end of the day. And it seems like most people aren't on the same page on this debate. So the risk-averse option for that is for bodybuilders who are crushing fucking hormones that don't really require maxed out steroidogenesis cascades from a testosterone production level, because their gonads essentially have no use for, cholesterol steroidogenesis downstream to producing testosterone. I'm not saying deprive the fuck out of yourself of LDL or something like that, but there is some metric that some very, very well-respected experts like Peter Attia believe are good proxies for kind of making it highly unlikely, if not nearly impossible, to end up with atherosclerosis, which ultimately eliminates one of the main risk factors for bodybuilders from a heart disease context. Now, again, this doesn't rule out the actual like left ventricular hypertrophy or changes in size and function, but this is a big fucking deal too for guys who are crushing a ton of food on a day-to-day basis, like Antoine Vaillant's CAC score, not fucking good. This is something that he would be hopefully implementing and looking at like quite closely. So Peter Attia's numbers that he felt made the most sense. And by the way, this is why it's prudent to get elaborate blood work done and know what you're looking for. Getting an apolipoprotein B done, not everyone does this. Most people just look at LDL, HDL, triglycerides, total cholesterol, the ratios. They don't look at apolipoprotein B. They don't look at LP(a). They don't look at these things above and beyond that. They don't get fasting insulins done to check their insulin sensitivity. They just check it hemoglobin, A1C. Like, this shit is, you need to dial in and get like actual high quality metrics done. So anyways, above and beyond, the clotting factors, obvious hematology, your CBC, RBC, hematocrit, hemoglobin, etc. Getting your GFR estimated through cystatin C, which is the gold standard for matching inulin clearance. Liver function tests, obviously. Above and beyond that, the systemic inflammation testing through high sensitivity CRP, clotting factors I mentioned. Getting into the lipids. So apolipoprotein B, Peter Attia views the ceiling to be roughly 60 milligrams per deciliter, and he would want everybody to be below the 5th percentile, which is about 62. And he says he just doesn't see, literally a quote from him, I just don't see a reason to have ApoB ever north of 60 milligrams per deciliter. So again, I'm not saying that that is the gold standard or, fucking go off of that 100%, but I certainly think that bodybuilders who are eating a fucking shit ton and are on tons of drugs that are inhibiting the completely breaking down HDL and heightening LDL significantly and cranking their fucking ApoBs through the roof. In addition, their LP(a) kind of up for, it seems to be potentially more genetically predetermined, but ultimately checking your ApoB and assessing this kind of metric, I think would be worthwhile for atherosclerosis. It's hard to fucking say, atherosclerosis potential. And again, this would be included in your lipid panel, in a high quality lipid panel. And there are different ways to lower it. Again, statin intervention, PCSK9 inhibitors, as well as things like ezetimibe. I've talked about these on the channel before. These are, some of them are vilified, I think, to an extent that is unwarranted, given the impact they can have on a bodybuilder's ability to avoid a heart attack. And again, having a more reasonable approach with a smaller, more minimum effective dose rather than super dosing a fucking statin that gives you side effects, talking to a high quality fucking doctor about PCSK9 inhibition if you have familial hypercholesterolemia. You shouldn't even be bodybuilding, to be honest, if you have that. But PCSK9 inhibition. Statins, if you synthesize too much cholesterol, that would be, reasonable, I think. In addition, if you have, like a hyperabsorber issue, using something like ezetimibe, so for me, for example, when I have any sort of dietary cholesterol, my LDL and total cholesterol numbers literally fucking double. Not everyone has what is represented in the literature about you have a fucking egg and this is what happens to your LDL. Some people hyper respond and end up over absorbing. They are called hyperabsorbers, and this is where ezetimibe would be more useful too. And a combination of all these things could realistically keep your lipid parameters in a spot as a bodybuilder that makes it pretty fucking unlikely that you're gonna end up with significant plaque buildup, which I think would be prudent even as early as your 20s for bodybuilders. And this is something to run by your doctor, of course. Now, as far as actual cardiac remodeling, having a high resting heart rate, high blood pressure chronically, these are things that would be addressed through electrolyte intake first as well. A lot of people are deficient in basic shit like magnesium. They have way too much sodium, not enough potassium and magnesium in their diets, and they end up with super high blood pressure, and this could be attenuated by literally fixing their mineral intake very fucking quickly. But above and beyond that, using proactive angiotensin receptor blockade with something like a telmisartan, I think is highly fucking advantageous and quite useful for preventing that LVH and cardiac remodeling. In addition, something like a beta blocker like nebivolol that is very cardioselective, I think would be worthwhile to look at too. I'm not saying you need to be on a fucking clusterfuck. I'm swearing on this one. You can see I'm getting fired up. You don't need to be on all these goddamn things, but I'm just saying, like for a top bodybuilder, for example, like this would be probably a cocktail of ancillaries that would be warranted to even handle the fucking stress of all the things they're doing to their system. And these are certainly things to at least run by your doctor and see what might be useful for you. And ultimately though, having a high body weight, like these are just band-aids at the end of the day. The fucking issue is a giant inflated body weight with massive amounts of food and massive amount of drugs, with body weight potentially being the biggest risk factor of all, believe it or not. I'm not saying for certain it's worse than the drugs, but like being 300 pounds fucking lean, fortunately doesn't apply for the majority of us, but it is escalating risk, like the amount of stress and fucking energy demands on your organ systems to support that much lean mass, metabolically active tissue, it's fucking mind-boggling. And yeah, your heart is gonna grow in unison with everything fucking else. So again, just because you're not 300 though, it doesn't mean you're free of risk. We see guys dropping who are just normal size looking bodybuilders or guys who are amateurs or whatever. You just don't see them publicized about as much because they are not as famous and credentialed through accolades and like pro bodybuilding shows and shit. This definitely happens. I've heard of numerous individuals ending up with cardiovascular disease, kidney fucking deterioration in their as early as their 20s. It's crazy, and people shouldn't be haphazardly getting on drugs. They should understand this stuff thoroughly first. Therapeutic phlebotomies if warranted, or just not using the drugs to begin with that got you to that point where you needed to because you had such viscous fucking blood. So many things that need to be accounted for. But I think the main things, again, like I mentioned, constantly staying on your blood pressure. If you're on your first cycle and you don't have a fucking blood pressure cuff already, like that should have been your first purchase, bro. In addition, baseline blood work or organ imaging, ideally an ultrasound of your heart. And yeah, you track that with time and you get it done, obviously on a less frequent basis is warranted for a guy who's super young and tolerant to drugs. But ultimately, you can track these changes over time. And I've seen people reverse and, remodel their heart in a positive fashion through things like nebivolol, through telmisartan use. But yeah, being proactive, trying to reverse an issue is magnitudes harder than just preventing it from happening in the first place. And I think we're realizing the real risks of this stuff as social media is brought to prominence and the public, very, very public passings of bodybuilders. In the past, this shit was just like, you'd hear it through the grapevine, you'd see it on forums, whatever it was, but you wouldn't see it like blow up on social media like it is now every single time it happens. It seems like every week somebody's dropping. And it's because literally every week somebody's fucking dropping. Like it's wild. And it might be not somebody you've heard of next week, but like somebody will fucking drop next week. Very likely. And it could be, just somebody that doesn't even have a social media, but somebody's fucking in a hospital right now as a result of pursuing some crazy bodybuilding lifestyle. I'm not trying to fearmonger the fuck out of bodybuilding to the point of telling you to not do it at all, but just be mindful of how hard you're pushing too. A lot of guys push to such an unnecessary degree where their genetics can't even handle the amount of drugs they're on. Like, you're not going to be a top IFBB pro if you're taking grams of shit and you can't win your fucking local show. Like, don't do it. Like, it's not worth it. So anyways, some proactive measures. I probably missed some shit, but that is kind of like the meat and potatoes, in my opinion, that I think should be worthwhile to look at. And hopefully that was informative. I try to do these educational segments every time something like this happens, and hopefully it helps people come away with something that prevents something like this happening to a viewer. So take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.